Hey. All right. All right. Sorry about this. I'm waiting a little bit. I'm going to send out some more invites to people before we start. So bear with me a little bit. There's a bit of a delay with the live stream from YouTube, it looks like. So if I don't see your questions, sorry. I'll try to do it as much as possible and hop back and forth. And so let me send this out real fast, and we're going to get going on some SCSS, and you should be able to watch this video later. There's probably about a couple minute delay in front as I was starting all of this stuff. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and get started by sharing my screen. So let me share my screen right here. And then I'm going to go ahead and open up CodePen.io. So before I get started, I just want to say that when I'm doing this, I would just recommend taking a step back, watching, listening, not trying to necessarily keep up with me. It might be a little bit too fast for you to be able to get all this. So just watch it, kind of absorb the basics of it, and then maybe try to do the exercises that I'm doing after and coming back to this video and referencing it. So for those who don't know, you might not even know what SCSS is. So SCSS is, think of CSS and being able to write it quicker and kind of more efficiently on large scale applications. So SCSS is what they call a preprocessor for CSS. So CSS getting style sheets. SCSS is to basically make it slightly easier to write SCSS. Now, the difference between SCSS and regular CSS is that with SCSS, you have to compile your code, essentially. That's why they call it a pre-compiler. So you have to, on your server or in your, if you're using your some different IDEs that you're using will do this for you. You basically have to take SCSS and change it into CSS, which is kind of a strange concept. There's all sorts of different preprocessors out there, and I'll kind of bring them up here for you on the screen. So what we're going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at SCSS, or another version of it is Sass. So you'll see Sass or SCSS. There is a slight difference between the two, which we don't have to go into today. One of them basically has semicolons, the other one doesn't. So SCSS or Sass, there's also less. Bootstrap uses SCSS a lot. They used to use less, and then they moved away from less to Sass. Not that that really technically matters. But what we're going to do is I'm just going to kind of dive into SCSS and show you some of the items that make it powerful. So let me go ahead and get into my CodePen. All right, so in CodePen, you'll see that there's HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But what we want to do is we want to start with SCSS. So I have to first set up the environment to allow SCSS to happen. So what I do is I click on this little cog icon here, and you'll see that there is a drop down that says CSS Preprocessor. So you have less, SCSS, Sass, and then all these other ones, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on SCSS, and I'm going to hit save and close. And now you'll notice where this box for the CSS stands, it now says SCSS. So that means we're ready to go when it comes to creating and writing SCSS code. So SCSS, one major thing that it really allows you to do outside the box that any beginner can start working on is using what we call nesting. So for example, in code, normal code, HTML, we nest items. So if let's say I wanted to create a navigation, I can start by creating a navigation like this. So I have my div or my nav, and then inside of that, I might want to put like a UL. And nested inside of my UL, I might have an LI. Something like that. Move this out a little bit. I'm going to put another underscore underneath that. So in standard HTML, we can do nesting. What I mean by that is that kind of like a Russian nesting doll, we have nav, and then inside of a nav, we have an unordered list. And inside of our unordered list, we have a list item. And then inside our list item, we have a link, and then the link name here. So in normal CSS, if I wanted to, in this example, let's say change the background or the color of all of my links right here, there's two ways I can do it. I can first and foremost go like this. So nav link, background red, great color. And let's say, okay, so I changed my color. Another way to kind of get and change this color would be to type something out like this. So I say nav, and I'm going to be more specific. So nav, menu, and then nav link. So this is a very specific CSS selection. it's first I'm selecting the nav, and then in there I'm going to the nav link or nav menu, and then I'm going to the nav link and I'm changing this nav link right here. So I'm gonna go ahead and change this to about. So let's say in this case I wanted to target and change this about list item and change the color to green. I can go nav menu, nav link, about, something like that. Now, the way I'm showing it is very specific, meaning I'm first selecting my nav, and then I'm selecting this unordered list, and then the li, and then the about, right? It's very specific. I could get away the same way going like so, right? Does the same thing. Now, one reason why you might want to be specific in when you're creating a application, as what we see up here, is because I might have two navigations on my page. I might have a navigation up here, and then I might have a footer navigation, right? So I could have, in theory, a nav below, an unordered list below in my footer. I can do something in there where I'm going to have, let's say, footer menu. So by having all of these kind of nesting dolls and having it where you are specific, it allows you to have a little bit more control based upon when you're scaling your application. So that way, my code for my main nav up above doesn't conflict with my footer down below. But you can see that real quickly it kind of gets hard to type and writing all of this out. So when you're creating CSS or SCSS, there is kind of a front-end mantra which is called "do not repeat yourself." So the idea is to try to eliminate doing the same thing over and over again as much as possible. Now, so far I've just showed you a little bit of CSS, and now what I'm going to show you is how to do this same thing. So I'm going to get rid of this footer down here. Super simple exercise. And I'm going to show you how you can nest. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first start off with my nav like this. Now, normally, if I put anything inside of here that wasn't like a property, like a background blue, CSS would break. But what I can do in my SCSS is in here, I can actually create classes with inside. So now I'm nesting. So you'll notice that. So I'm going to go like this. I'm going to say at the ampersand. I'm going to go here. Okay. So now you notice that with my nesting, I can start to put items inside of each other just the same way I would in HTML. So my SCSS code over here, it might look a bit strange, but what I'm doing is first I'm selecting my nav up here, and then in here I'm using this symbol. What it does is it's going to inherit the parent. So think of it as super glue. So I'm concatenating two strings together. I'm super gluing two strings together. What I'm super gluing is I'm super gluing this nav and then underscore underscore menu. So essentially what it's doing is it's creating this right here. And then I'm going and putting yellow behind it. Now I want to target this about section here, so what I can do is I could do dot about and then background blue. So let's go ahead and see what this thing actually views. So I'm going to save this, and I'm going to go into debug mode right here. So then I can, from here, I can view the source so we can see what the compiled code actually looks like. So this is the compiled CSS over here. So I have nav underscore underscore menu background yellow. So what it's doing is, again, it's, if I'm over here, it's taking the parent above, it's super gluing it together, and it says background yellow. Now I have dot for class about background blue. So let's check that out. So that's what it's creating right here. All right. So some other things that's pretty cool about CSS with the nesting is you can also start to create variables. So let's say in a design, you have a color that you're going to repeat over and over again. So let's say in this case, we're going to repeat yellow over and over again. Now, this is what you can do in SCSS is you can set basically what they call more variables. So in this case, I'm going to say primary yellow. Now what this allows me to do is in my code, wherever I want to reference yellow, I can change it like this. So let's say in this beautiful design down here, I wanted to have the menu or the media say, and I don't know why I called it about right here. I wanted media to be yellow text. What I can do is I can nest in here an anchor tag, and then I can say color primary. So you'll notice, let me put some padding on this hideous design. That I have a yellow text for media right here. Now, the huge advantage of this is that as a designer and as a developer, let's say the client says that they want to change all of the yellows to red, I can come in here and just change one line of code, and everything on my page that is referenced primary right here now turns to red. So we're starting to add some of that logic that JavaScript and all of the other programming languages have, is we're starting to add some logic to our CSS. Again, if I wanted to change this to, let's say, green, it's one line of code. And now all the items that reference primary are set to green. To kind of show you how this plays out, I'm going to go ahead and go back into debug mode. I'm going to view the page source. And you'll see here, so the primary color was set to red, and it injects red here, and it also injects red below. Now, one thing, this is kind of a caveat, when you're doing CSS and SCSS and basically any programming at all, you need to be very careful of what you name things. So the reason why I named this primary is because primary can be any color. Now, if I had set this to green, and I set these to green, what would happen if I'm asked to change this green to, let's say, purple? Now, all of a sudden, my code stops making sense from a legibility standpoint, because what I'm saying is green is purple. That's like saying apple is orange. People might get confused, and you might confuse yourself as you are starting to program things out. So you want to kind of try to keep your code, is your CSS staying away from kind of generic terms like green and yellow and blue, and kind of moving it into like secondary, primary. You might even get away with like background or dark. That allows you to recycle your code more and stops you from having to go back and change all of your references. Okay, so another item that is really wonderful about SCSS, I'm going to knock some of this stuff out, is that you can do equations. So let's just go ahead and I'm going to create a box. Okay. So I have this wonderful box. Now, another way I can write this, if I wanted to, is I can say height width. Something like so. Oh, $, get rid of that. So what this allows me to do is let's say I wanted to come in here and I wanted to create another box. But let's say for whatever reason I wanted to name this square. I can come in here and I can say square. I could say background red. Okay. So now you'll see that I have two boxes that are the same height and width. Again, the nice thing about this is if I want to change something, I want to change the height on both boxes, I just have to change 2 lines of code rather than coming in here and changing it 4 lines of code or doing a find and replace. Now, let's say in whatever world, I wanted to have this square div right here that I have. I want it to be twice as big as whatever I set my box to. So normally what I'd have to do is I'd have to go in here and say, okay, that's 100 pixels. So the old days, I go in here and I'd say, okay, now that's what's that times 2? That's 200 pixels, and the width is 200 pixels. And that's going to double the size of my red box down here. But with SCSS, what I can do is I can actually do equations. So what I'm going to say is I'm saying for my square height, which is set to 100 pixels, and I'm going to times that by 2. And then width, which is 100 pixels, I'm going to times that by 2 as well. I can do times. I can even do division. I can do subtraction. You're not going to really see very much, but let's go ahead and make it bigger. I can do addition as well. So again, one really nice and amazing feature about SCSS is it's starting to add logic to your style sheets. So not only do you get nesting and being able to nest, you also get some logic that you can start to play around with, where you can change the height of items or the colors of items based upon a equation, which I think is actually pretty interesting. So one more item that I'm going to show you is I'm going to go ahead and I'll show a little bit of what they call a mix-in. So mix-ins are a way to condense your code even further. How you use a mix-in is first you create a mix-in. So let's go ahead and just do this up here. So I'm going to use the same one with the square. So I want to create two squares, and I want to create them the same width and height. Rather than doing it where I have my properties set up like this, I can come in here and I can create what they call a mix-in. So I'm going to create a mix-in called the box mix-in. And in here, I'm going to say my height is 300 pixels. Width is 300 pixels. And you'll notice I still don't have any boxes on my screen. So what I need to do now is I'm going to, first I create a mix-in, which is basically kind of a list of properties. And then I'm going to inject my mix-in using the include. So I'm going to say include. I called it box mix-in. So there, all of a sudden, I have one mix-in here. So what it's doing is it's taking my box, it's adding green, it's saying display flex, then it's going to include, and up here, it comes up to the top, it finds this mix-in named box mix-in, and then it says, okay, I'm going to include these items in here. I'm going to include this and this. So now if I want to do the same thing down here, I want to put my red box back, I'm going to say include, and then box mix-in. So down below, now all of a sudden I have another box. Again, the cool thing about this is now that rather than having to change a bunch of lines of code, I can come in here and change 2 lines of code. Now you might be asking, well, Miles, why would I want to do this when I can just use kind of like the variable method the way before? Now, one reason why you might want to use mix-in is let's say, for example, you want to now add a margin or a padding to all these boxes. I want to add a margin of, let's say, 20 pixels to all of these. Now all I have to do is write one line of code. Rather than coming in here and margin here and then margin here, make it exactly the same, I can recycle my code by just typing in one line. And if I wanted to do it even more, let's say border radius in pixels, there you go. So the mix-in, let's go ahead and change the view so you can see what's going on. Let's go back to debug mode. It is going ahead and it is injecting again all of the additional items. So you'll see that it's injecting in the height and the width and the margin and the border radius. Now these are just some of the basic features of SCSS. To be honest with you, there's all sorts of functions that you can use to make it even more crazy. Like you can go really in depth with SCSS. And this is just kind of serving as a way to kind of show you that there is this world of SCSS out there, and that it's something that's really cool and you can play around with, and it's going to make your code be generated so much faster once you start to kind of grasp it. Really, if you just grasp how to nest and how to create variables, you start to be able to produce front-end code and HTML and CSS so much faster. If you have that and you couple it with like Emmet, and then now all of a sudden your production speed goes up a ton, like way faster. And then starting including mix-ins and then functions, just adding bit by bit onto it, you really start to be able to create incredibly complex designs at a really rapid pace. Now I told you that I was going to show a little bit of SCSS or CSS animation, so I don't want to not do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I will do that real quick, and then I will go on to the live stream and see if there's any questions. I know I'm going through a lot, and again, this is just more of a introduction to show you that there is this thing called SCSS out there. And later on, if you enjoy this, we can start getting more complex into creating functions, really going into mix-ins, when to use them, when not to use them, or how to create a page more rapidly, and have a session where we're creating a page together using SCSS. This is just kind of to get your toe. So let's go ahead, and what I'll do is I'm gonna take all this stuff out, and I'm gonna show you some CSS animation, and I'm going to do it using SCSS. So let's get started. What I'm gonna do is it's gonna be super simple. I'm just gonna have a block on my page that moves a little bit to the left, and it's gonna shoot off the page. So I'm gonna add some anticipation. I'm gonna have a block on my page, and it's just gonna kind of like load up, and it's gonna zoom off the side of my page. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna first create a container for my block, and then inside of that, my container, I'm going to put in a block. And then what I'm going to do is let's go ahead into my CSS. I'm going to kind of set up a background for this. So my container, I'm going to set this thing to display flex. And again, I'm not asking you to stay up with me. I'm just trying to do this as quickly as possible. And then I'm going to set my height of 100 VH and a width of 100 V width. And then I'm going to say background. What color do I want to use? I really like tomato. Okay, and then I'm going to say margin 0, padding 0. I could have done all of this on the body too, but I'm using container so that way we can see how this plays out. And I'll go ahead and in my body up here, actually I'll just do a star to nuclearize it. I'm gonna say a margin 0 pix, padding. Okay, so that's getting rid of that border. Again, this container, I could have put it all on the body. But I didn't. So let's go ahead and let's also start to create this block. So inside my container, so I'm starting to nest, I'm going to create a block. And we will have this block have a width of, let's say, 10, a height of 5. And say background is going to be white. Okay, there we go. So pretty so far. And then let's go ahead and let's move this block down a little bit. So let's say There we go. Okay. Oh, such an amazing design so far. So I have this amazing tomato background with this white block on it on the left-hand side. So beautiful. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this block. I'm going to have it first just kind of jump across the screen. So I'm going to have it go from left side to the right side using a keyframe animation. So what I'm going to do is first thing I'm going to create is I'm going to set up my animation. So in my block, I'm going to use a CSS property called Animation. And in Animation, it can take, if I'm using the shorthand version, it can take all sorts of different properties. First, it kind of takes the name. So I'm going to say, and it's the name of the animation you're going to create. So I'm going to create an animation, and I'm going to call it Anticipation, which is one of the 5 principles of animation. Then I'm going to say, how long am I going to delay it for? Let's say 5 seconds. How often do I want to do this animation? I'm going to say infinite. And then how long do I want this animation to take hold? I'm going to say 1 second. All right. So you notice I have this animation up here. Nothing happens. Super cool. Amazing animation, right? Well, what I need to do now is I'm going to use this thing called keyframes. So keyframes are from animation. If you are an animation nerd, it is basically telling an animator. Keyframe is like a freeze frame, and it's telling an animator where a character should be at a specific place in time. So for example, normally when it comes to video and film, there's 24 frames per second, meaning every single second of film, there's 24 individual frames. And a keyframe animation would be where a designer or an animator says, okay, at frame 12, which is halfway through 1 second, I want Daffy Duck to pick up this rock off the ground. So they go ahead and they draw Daffy Duck at keyframe number 12. And that tells the other animators, which they call tweeners, to make sure that they hit this specific point in time, which is at halfway through the sequence at 12 frames. I want Daffy Duck to be making sure that he's picking up that rock. So in traditional animation, a junior or a senior level animator would go ahead and they would create keyframes. So let's say picking up a rock at frame 12, and then at frame 16, he has the rock and he's stood up and he's looking at the rock. So they draw out the main pictures, and then from that, another junior animator would come through and draw out all of the frames between those two movements. And so that's a way for them to be able to produce more animation faster. Now, with the advent of computers and computer-generated animation, the computer does that for us. And for us in CSS animation, we are setting up the main frames where we're telling the computer where we want our item to be, and then the computer goes ahead and fills in the blank. So now that doesn't make, you're probably like, what the heck is this guy talking about? Best way is to show you. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna say at animation frame 0, and this is, I have a whole rant about how I actually kind of hope that they rewrite animation. I'm going to say at 0% of this animation, I want margin left to be 0 VW. So I don't want any margin. Then at 100% of this animation, I want margin left to be 100 VW. Okay, so there it goes. So what's happening is that I have an animation. It's called Anticipation. It's going for wait for 0.5 second every time. and then infinitely it's going to fire the animation, and it's going to play it at a speed of 1 second. So 0% of 1 second, I have my block on the left-hand side, and then at 1 full second, it's going to be way over here. Now you'll notice it kind of has this effect that it speeds up and then slows down. But if I wanted to, let's say, have it slow down even more, what I can do is I can come over here, and I'm going to say at 80%, I want it to be at, let's say, 96, like this. Let's see what happens. So you'll notice it starts to pause. Let's make it a bit more dramatic than that. You kind of see it a little bit. Make it even more dramatic. There you go. So now what I'm saying in my animation is I'm saying, okay, at 0% of 1 second, I want to start off margin left 0. Then 30% through my animation, I have 1 second. So 30% of 1 second, I want it to be all the way over here. And it's going to be at 98 VW, so viewer width, which is pretty much all the way over here. And then it has 70% more time to get to the very end. Now I can change this sequence and make it faster or slower by just changing this number up here. So if I change it to 3, let's see what happens. Slows everything down a bit, make it even more drastic, 100 seconds. So it's waiting a long time. Somehow I broke it. Well, that's the darndest thing. Why would it break like that? Okay, let's undo that. So weird. There we go. Didn't like that. CodePen did not like that. Okay. So to add some anticipation, let's kind of take this a step further. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say, I'm going to get rid of all the stuff. I'm going to say, okay, at 80% of my animation, I actually want my block to move backwards. So I'm going to have it move backwards. Then I'm going to have it at 90%. I want it to pause there. I want it to stay in that kind of like a cocked position. I want it to move ever so slightly backwards more. And at 100%, I want it to just, I want it to blast off the other side of the screen. So let's see what happens. So you're not gonna, what, there you go. It's probably too fast, right? Now it looks like I'm having this strobing effect. So what's happening is I'm moving so far across the screen that my eye can't pick up and the computer can't pick up where to the transition. So it's kind of giving this weird strobing effect. So I just got it way too drastic. So what I can do is I can slow it down a bit by like this. There you go. Even that's too much, right? But it's still really kind of blasting off the screen. So I encourage you to play around with these animations. Again, it's animation, and I would use keyframes. And you can still, with this, you can do other things as well. You can, so I have my background, which is set to white. Let's say I wanted to change my background as this goes. So I'm going to say at 0% background white. And then at 70%, I wanted to say background, let's go to like a black. And then as I talk it up even more, I'm going to say background is going to start to turn to a purple. Purple and red is probably not going to be good. And then background, I'm going to change this back to white as it hits 100%. So let's see what happens now. This is going to be probably pretty interesting. It starts going. Knock this down. There you go. So just with a little bit of CSS animation knowledge, you can start to make some trippy effects. So if you like that, let me know as well. We can do more and more animation, get more crazy with our animation. I love animation and trying to do pure CSS animations. Let me show you some of the stuff that got going on. Bear with me 1 second. So for example, I know it's super wonderful, but it's like a bouncing ball. I love the 12 principles of animation. So if you can animate a bouncing ball, you can animate anything, which is something else I can show. But anyway, so that's kind of what I have now, if there's anyone still left out there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the live view. I'm going to bring up my YouTube. So that way I can see if there's any questions. All right, so I'm reading some of questions. Jackie has a question, which is, what are the requirements to use SCSS on a project that a vanilla HTML/CSS/JavaScript? So to use SCSS on a project, you really need to have a compiler on your computer. I believe Visual Studio Code comes with it already, with a compiler. You can use like Grunt and all sorts of different pieces of software to compile your SCSS down. So basically what happens is that it compiles your SCSS file into a CSS file, and that's what you would upload to your server. Now, one sticking point that a lot of people have an inception going on the screen here. Let me move it to a different screen. One sticking point that I see a lot of people who are starting off with SCSS kind of do incorrectly is, let me go back to a CodePen to kind of show an example of this, is they'll accidentally try to link in. So in your HTML, you have like a link, right? A style sheet like this. And normally you would type in like style.css. Now, when you're using SCSS, you still use style.css. So you have a file, and it compresses it down on your machine to style.css, or on the server style.css. What I'll see a lot of people do is they'll type in style.scss, and they'll be like, Miles, why is my style sheet not working? Well, it's because the browser doesn't know. It's still looking for in your file for this style.css, and it's pulling it up. But the browser literally doesn't know what to do with it. And so it just breaks your code, and you don't see any of the design. If you're on a Mac, one piece of software that I completely love is called CodeKit. It's like 30, 40 bucks. What it does is it allows you to create, let me bring one up, let's see. It's basically a compiler for you. And what it'll do, everything's missing because I moved computers. But what it'll do is it compresses your SCSS files for you, but it also allows you to kind of do all sorts of crazy things when it comes to watching what you're doing on your screen. So I don't know how to explain it. Let me just pull up the site to show you a little bit more of it. So CodeKit. And unfortunately, this is only for Windows, or sorry, Mac. So it allows you to use browser syncing, which I think is the coolest thing. That normally, like Visual Code and all that, VS Code and all that, you can have a browser open, and when you make a change to your style sheet, it automatically reloads, right? That's like a live browser refresh. What's kind of interesting about CodeKit is they actually allow you to have a link that you can set up, and you can view, as long as you're on your same network, you can have like an iPad set up, you can have your a Samsung phone set up, you can have all sorts of like devices set up, and as you change your SCSS, it'll automatically refresh all those devices, so you can check on all of those devices at the exact same time, rather than having to go into emulators and do all these other different things. Again, it's a system. I really like this one where it helps you automatically optimize images, compile CSS code. But you can get away with not having to do any of this stuff if you're using the right like NPM packages and JavaScript packages to compile this stuff for you, and especially on the server side. And again, most browsers most IDEs are automatically shipping with these compilers enabled, and so you just have to enable it based upon which IDE you're using. So hopefully that helps out a little bit, but we can go into a whole thing on that as well. So then I have another question is when using numericals in animation, is it not required to utilize 3 pix, 3%, etc.? So you do have to, let's go back into here. And I probably cleared it all out, right? Because I'm a dummy like that. So yes, you still need to set in your animation the property and the property value type, meaning like what you're asking is do you still need to set in like the width or pixel or percentage? And yes, you do. You still have to do that. The only time you still have to do it up here as well is so up in the top when you're setting the animation, this S stands for seconds. So you're saying how many seconds, and then you're going to repeat it infinite amount. And then down here, you can see that in all of these different instances, we have it where, so this is bottom, and then bottom is 30 view height, so view height, and then we're at 17%, 11, sorry, 34%. So you still have to have the property, or the type, I guess you would say, of increment or measurement, the type of measurement that you want to have. So that's a good question, definitely. Are there any other kind of big questions out there? I know I went through so much stuff. Yeah, so if you have any other additional, and thank you, Jackie, if you have any other additional topics, or if you'd like me to kind of go into how to use SCSS on creating a specific page, or if you want to say, hey, Miles, let's animate a bouncing ball, or work on just any sort of subject that you would like to have go over. What we're trying to do is the cohort and I, we're trying to help out the community while we're kind of in this crazy period of coronavirus and lockdown and all that fun stuff. And so we want to make sure that we're able to contribute and kind of educate and help push everyone. So any questions out there, feel free to Slack me, come up with different topics if you find this helpful at all. If you want to know how to set SCSS on your Windows machine or SCSS on your project using project, I'd love to go into that. So if there's no more questions or any questions, then I'll just end this right now. And I want to say thank you. Bye.